I never thought I'd be standing alone in a cold, dimly lit closet, holding my late husband's shirt, trembling with a mix of disbelief and betrayal. The scent of his cologne, faint but unmistakable, choked me as I lit the match. The flames swallowed the fabric, my heart feeling like it was burning along with it. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I'm 75 years old. I live in a small 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, New York, where the walls are thin enough to hear Mrs. Rodriguez arguing with her son downstairs, and the radiator clanks like an old ghost every morning at 5:30. The peeling floral wallpaper that Harold and I picked out in 1978 still clings stubbornly to the kitchen walls, yellowed now like old photographs. Every surface in this place holds a memory. The wooden chair by the window where Harold used to read his newspapers. The coffee mug with the chip on the handle that I refused to throw away. The framed wedding photo on the mantel, where we're both so young and hopeful, not knowing what life would throw at us. Every morning, I wake to the screech of the M15 bus pulling away from the stop across the street. The sound cuts through my dreams like a knife, dragging me back to reality. I shuffle to the kitchen in my worn slippers, the linoleum cold against my feet, and make myself a cup of coffee, strong and black, just like Harold liked it. The silence in the apartment is so thick I can almost touch it. Sometimes I turn on the television just to hear voices, even if they're selling me something I don't need. My days stretch out like empty pages. I water the struggling philodendron on the windowsill. I sort through mail that's mostly bills and advertisements for funeral homes. I stare at my phone, willing it to ring with my son David's voice. When it does ring, it's usually a telemarketer asking if I want to extend my car warranty. I don't even own a car anymore. Last Tuesday, my arthritis was acting up something fierce. My knees felt like they were filled with broken glass, and I could barely make it to the kitchen. I called David's number, hoping he might have time to talk, maybe even visit. The phone rang 4 times before his wife Jessica answered. "Oh, hi Margaret," she said, and I could hear the forced politeness in her voice. "David's not available right now. He's dealing with some important business matters. Important business matters. In Seattle, where they moved 6 months ago. Where he opened that coffee shop with the money I gave him from my retirement savings. $40,000. Most of what Harold and I had scraped together over 30 years of marriage. Could you tell him I called?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. "Sure, I'll let him know," Jessica replied, but something in her tone told me she wouldn't. That was 3 days ago. He still hasn't called back. I remember when David was 8 years old, and he broke his arm falling off his bicycle. I sat with him in that emergency room for 6 hours, holding his good hand while he cried. I sang him the lullaby my mother used to sing to me, about sailing away to dreamland. When the nurses finally set his bone and put on the cast, he looked up at me with those big brown eyes, Harold's eyes, and said, "Mommy, you're the best person in the whole world." Where did that little boy go? When did I stop being the best person in his world? I've been asking myself that question for months now, ever since Harold died. The cancer took him slowly, eating away at him piece by piece, until there was nothing left but skin stretched over bones and a smile that never quite reached his eyes anymore. I cared for him every day for 2 years. I fed him soup when he couldn't keep anything else down. I changed his sheets when the medication made him sick. I held him when he cried in the middle of the night, afraid of what was coming. David visited twice during those 2 years. Twice. Both times he stayed for less than an hour, checking his phone constantly, making excuses about work and travel plans. Jessica never came at all. She sent flowers to the funeral, expensive ones, probably ordered online, but she couldn't be bothered to show up and hold my hand while they lowered my husband of 47 years into the ground. But I forgave them. I always forgive them. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We forgive and we hope and we keep loving even when it feels like trying to hug smoke. After the funeral, David called me once a week for about a month. Then it became every 2 weeks. Then once a month. Now I'm lucky if I hear from him every 6 weeks, and when I do, the conversations are stilted and brief. "How's your health?" "Fine." "How's the weather?" "Cold." "Are you eating enough?" Yes. Okay, Mom, I have to go. Important business matters. I keep replaying our conversations in my head, looking for clues about when things changed. Was it when Harold got sick and I couldn't hide how much I needed help? Was it when I asked David to come home for Thanksgiving last year and he said they already had plans with Jessica's family in Portland? Or was it something deeper, something that had been growing like a cancer of its own, invisible until it was too late to treat? The apartment feels smaller every day, like the walls are closing in. I've started talking to Harold's picture, telling him about my day, asking him what I should do. The silence that follows is deafening, but sometimes I swear I can feel him listening. I gave him everything, I whisper to Harold's photograph. Remember when he wanted to go to that expensive summer camp when he was 12? We ate pasta for 3 months straight so we could afford it. Remember when he needed money for college, for his wedding, for the down payment on his first apartment? We never said no. Not once. The photo doesn't answer, of course. But Harold's eyes seem sadder than they used to. Like even in death, he can see what our generosity has cost us. I think about the day David told me he was moving to Seattle. He called instead of visiting, which should have been my first clue. Mom, Jessica got a job offer out there. It's too good to pass up. We're thinking of starting fresh, you know? Starting fresh. As if their old life, the life that included me, was something dirty that needed washing away. What about the coffee shop? I asked, thinking of all those plans we'd made together, all those conversations about him finally being his own boss. We'll sell it, he said, casual as discussing the weather. The real estate market is hot right now. We should make a decent profit. Profit? On my $40,000. On my dreams of Saturday mornings spent in his little cafe, watching him make lattes and smile at customers. On my vision of being the grandmother who brought cookies for the regulars and had a special table by the window. When are you leaving? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Next month, he said. Look, Mom, I know this is sudden, but it's a great opportunity. You understand, right? I understood. I understood that I wasn't part of the opportunity. I understood that starting fresh meant starting without me. But I said what mothers say. Of course, honey. I want what's best for you. The lie tasted bitter in my mouth. They left on a rainy Thursday morning in March. I stood at my window and watched them load their moving truck, even though they hadn't invited me to help, or even to say goodbye in person. David looked up at my window once, and for a moment, I thought he might wave. But Jessica called his name, and he turned away. I haven't seen him since. The money I gave him for the coffee shop, that was supposed to be my nest egg. Harold and I had saved it penny by penny, dollar by dollar, over decades of careful living. We never took vacations. We drove the same car for 15 years. We bought generic groceries and clipped coupons and turned down the heat every winter to save on the electric bill. Also, we'd have something to leave to David, something to help him build a better life than we'd had. Instead, I gave it to him early, thinking I was helping him achieve his dreams. Now, I clip coupons not out of habit, but out of necessity. My Social Security check barely covers the rent and groceries. I've had to give up my landline, my cable television, even my subscription to the newspaper Harold used to love. I make my coffee weaker now to make the can last longer. I buy generic medication and hope my body doesn't notice the difference, but I don't regret giving him the money. I regret that it didn't buy me what I thought it would, a place in his new life. Last month was my birthday, 75 years on this earth, and the only card I received was from my dentist's office, reminding me about my overdue cleaning appointment. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, eating a piece of grocery store cake I'd bought for myself, and waited for the phone to ring. It never did. 2 days later, David sent a text message. Just a text. Sorry I missed your birthday, Mom. Things have been crazy here. Love you. Love you. 2 words that used to mean everything, now feeling like spare change thrown at a beggar. I type back, thank you, honey. I love you too, and hit send, even though I want to type 100 other things. I want to ask why he couldn't pick up the phone. I want to tell him how I sat alone with my slice of cake, making a wish on a single candle that my children might remember I exist. I want to ask when I became so forgettable. But I don't type any of that. Fear holds my fingers back. Fear that if I complain, if I ask for too much, I might lose even these scraps of attention. Winter came early last year, and with it, the worst flu I'd had in decades. My fever spiked to 102, and I could barely get out of bed to make myself tea. I lay on the couch wrapped in every blanket I owned, shivering and coughing until my ribs ached. I called David's number, desperate enough to risk seeming needy. Jessica answered again. "Margaret, is this important? David's in a meeting." "I'm sick," I managed between coughs. "Really sick." "Oh, that's too bad. You should probably see a doctor. I'll tell David you called." Click. The line went dead, and I was alone again with my fever and my fear. 3 days passed before David called me back. By then, the fever had broken, and I was sitting up sipping chicken broth from a can. "Mom, Jessica said you were under the weather. Are you feeling better?" Under the weather. As if I'd had the sniffles instead of thinking I might die alone in this apartment with no one to find me until the smell seeped through the walls. "Much better," I lied, because the truth seemed too heavy for a phone call. "Good. You know, you should think about getting one of those Life Alert things. Just in case." Life Alert. A plastic button around my neck. A constant reminder that I'm one fall away from becoming a headline in the local paper. Elderly woman found dead after 3 days. How romantic. How dignified. "I'll think about it," I said, though we both knew I couldn't afford it. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of life continuing around me. Mrs. Rodriguez's television murmuring through the thin walls. The couple upstairs having one of their usual arguments about money. A siren wailing somewhere in the distance, rushing to help someone, anyone, but not me. I thought about Harold. About how he used to say that families were like gardens. They needed tending and attention or they'd wither away. Looking around my empty apartment, I wondered if our family garden was already dead, if I was just too stubborn to admit it. But mothers don't give up on their children. We can't. It's not in our nature. So I kept trying. I sent care packages to Seattle, filled with David's favorite cookies and the tea he used to drink when he had a cold. I called on holidays, always getting Jessica's polite but distant voice. I sent money when I could, small amounts scraped together from my grocery budget, with notes saying, "Just a little something to help with expenses." The packages came back unopened. The money was never mentioned. My calls went increasingly unanswered. I started to feel like a ghost haunting my own son's life, present but unseen, loving but unwanted. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Thursday in November, gray and cold, the kind of day that makes you want to crawl back into bed and wait for spring. I was dusting the bookshelf in my bedroom when I knocked over Harold's cologne bottle, the one I'd kept on my dresser since he died. As I bent to pick it up, something caught my eye in the back of my closet. A flash of blue, familiar blue. I pushed aside my winter coats and saw it hanging there, hidden behind my old church dress, Harold's favorite shirt. The pale blue cotton button-down with the faded collar and the tiny coffee stain near the bottom hem that I'd never been able to scrub out completely. The shirt he wore every Sunday to church. The shirt he was wearing in our last photograph together, sitting on the bench in Flushing Meadows Park last spring, his arm around my waist, both of us squinting into the camera phone Jessica had reluctantly agreed to hold. But this shirt wasn't supposed to be in my closet. I'd given it to David after the funeral, along with Harold's watch and his wedding ring and a few other things I thought he might want to remember his father by. David had held the shirt against his chest that day, tears rolling down his cheeks, and promised he'd treasure it always. So why was it here? Why was it hidden in the back of my closet like a secret? My hands shook as I pulled it from the hanger. The fabric still held a faint trace of Harold's cologne, Old Spice, the same kind he'd worn since we were teenagers. For a moment, I buried my face in the material and breathed in the ghost of my husband's presence. Then I saw the tag sewn into the collar. In Harold's careful handwriting, faded but still visible, "Property of Harold Patterson, 1978. This was definitely Harold's shirt. But how had it gotten back into my closet? I sank onto my bed, the shirt clutched in my trembling hands, and tried to piece together the puzzle. David had taken it with him when he cleaned out Harold's things. I remembered watching him fold it carefully and place it in the box with the other items. So how? The answer hit me like a slap across the face. Jessica had been here. She'd been in my apartment. in my personal space, looking through my things. She'd returned the shirt, not because she wanted me to have it, but because she didn't want any reminders of Harold in her new life. She'd probably snuck it back into my closet during one of their brief visits, thinking I wouldn't notice. The realization made my stomach clench. She'd treated Harold's memory like garbage, something to be disposed of quietly when no one was looking, and David had let her do it. Maybe he'd even helped her do it. I sat there holding that shirt for over an hour, tears streaming down my face. All those years of trying to be the perfect mother-in-law, of biting my tongue when Jessica made her little cutting remarks, of pretending I didn't notice how she rolled her eyes when I spoke, or how she steered conversations away from me at family gatherings. All those years of telling myself she was just shy, just needed time to warm up to me. But this wasn't shyness. This was deliberate cruelty. This was someone who saw me as so insignificant that she could invade my home and discard pieces of my life without consequence. The worst part was the secrecy of it. If she'd simply asked me to take the shirt back, I would have understood. I might have been hurt, but I would have understood. Instead, she'd snuck around like a thief, treating me like I was too stupid to notice, too pathetic to matter. I thought about all the signs I'd ignored over the years. The way Jessica's smile never reached her eyes when she looked at me. The way she always had somewhere else to be when I tried to start a conversation. The way she'd interrupt me mid-sentence or answer questions meant for David. The way she'd managed to convince my son to move 3,000 miles away from his grieving mother. Had she planned this from the beginning? Had she been systematically working to remove me from David's life, piece by piece? Memory by memory? I stood up slowly, my knees protesting, and walked to my dresser mirror. The woman looking back at me was old, tired, defeated. Gray hair that hadn't seen a proper salon in months. Eyes red-rimmed from crying. Shoulders curved forward under the weight of too much sorrow. When had I become so small? When had I started accepting crumbs instead of demanding the respect I'd earned? When had I stopped fighting for my place in my own son's life? Harold's shirt was still in my hands. I could smell the coffee stain. Could remember the morning he'd spilled it while reading me the funny pages from the newspaper. He'd laughed so hard at a comic strip that his hand had shaken, and coffee had splashed across his chest. I'd scolded him for being careless, never knowing it would become one of my most precious memories. Harold would be ashamed of what I'd become. He'd be furious at how David and Jessica were treating me. He'd never let anyone disrespect his family the way I'd been disrespected. But Harold was gone. It was just me now, alone in this apartment with my memories and my ghosts, and my stubborn refusal to admit that my son might not love me the way I loved him. Something shifted inside me in that moment. Something that had been bending for years finally snapped. I wasn't going to be the pathetic old woman anymore, grateful for scraps of attention from children who saw me as an obligation. I wasn't going to pretend that cruelty was just carelessness, that neglect was just busy schedules. I was going to stop making excuses for them. I walked to the kitchen and turned on the gas burner. The blue flame danced in the dim light, hungry and alive. I held Harold's shirt over it and watched the corner catch fire. The fabric curled and blackened, releasing smoke that made my eyes water. Or maybe that was just my tears. As the shirt burned, I thought about all the times I'd set myself on fire to keep David warm. All the sacrifices I'd made that had gone unnoticed and unappreciated. All the love I'd poured out that had never been returned. I was done burning myself for people who couldn't even be bothered to remember my birthday. The shirt turned to ash in my hands, and with it, something else burned away too. My willingness to accept mistreatment. My desperate need for approval from people who clearly didn't value me. My fear of being alone, which I now realized was nothing compared to the pain of being invisible to the people I loved most. I swept the ashes into the trash and washed my hands thoroughly, scrubbing away the smell of smoke. Then I sat at my kitchen table and did something I hadn't done in years. I made a plan. First, I was going to call David and tell him exactly what I'd found and exactly how it made me feel. No more tiptoeing around Jessica's feelings. No more pretending that this kind of treatment was acceptable. If he wanted to be in my life, he was going to have to earn his place there, just like everyone else. Second, I was going to stop sending money I couldn't afford to send. Stop sending packages that came back unopened. Stop calling people who clearly didn't want to hear from me. Third, I was going to start living for myself instead of for the approval of others. I was 75 years old, and I'd earned the right to spend my remaining years surrounded by people who actually wanted me around. The phone felt heavy in my hands as I dialed David's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, Jessica's voice answered, saccharine and false. "Hi, Margaret. David's not available right now." "Then make him available," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months. "This is important." There was a pause. "I'm sorry, but he's really busy with—" "Jessica," I interrupted. "Put my son on the phone. Now." Another pause. Longer this time. I heard muffled conversation in the background. Jessica's voice urgent and David's responding with what sounded like irritation. Finally, David came on the line. "Mom? Jessica said you sounded upset. Is everything okay?" "No," I said simply. "Everything is not okay. We need to talk. Look, if this is about your birthday, I already apologized. I've been swamped with work and it's not about my birthday." I cut him off. "It's about your father's shirt, the one I found hidden in my closet." Silence stretched across the 3,000 miles between us. I could hear David's breathing, quick and shallow. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said finally, but his voice had changed. Gone was the casual dismissal, replaced by something that sounded almost like panic. "The blue button-down," I continued. "The one with the coffee stain. The one you cried over at his funeral. The one you promised you'd treasure forever. It was hanging in the back of my closet, David. Hidden away like someone's dirty secret." More silence. Then, quietly, "Mom, I can explain. I'm listening. We thought it might be better if you had it back. Since you were having such a hard time after Dad died, we thought maybe having his clothes around would help you feel closer to him." The lie was so smooth, so reasonable sounding, that for a moment I almost believed it. But I'd had decades of practice reading David's voice, and I knew when he wasn't telling me the truth. "So, instead of talking to me about it, you snuck into my apartment and hid it in my closet?" "We didn't sneak. When were you here, David? When did you come to New York without telling me?" Another long pause. "Jessica had some business in the city a few months ago. She stopped by to check on you." Business in the city. Jessica, who worked as a massage therapist in Seattle and had never mentioned having any connections in New York. Another lie. "She stopped by to check on me?" I repeated. "Stopped by when I wasn't here? Stopped by with a key I never gave her?" "Mom, you're making this sound like something it wasn't. We were trying to be thoughtful." Thoughtful. The word tasted like poison in my mouth. "David," I said slowly, "do you remember your father's funeral?" "Of course I do." "Do you remember what you promised me that day?" His voice got smaller. "I remember. You promised you'd take care of me. You promised you wouldn't abandon me the way your father worried you might. You promised you'd always be my son, no matter what." "I am your son." "No," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "You're Jessica's husband. You're a business owner in Seattle. You're a lot of things. But you haven't been my son for a very long time. That's not fair." "Fair?" The word came out as a laugh, sharp and bitter. "You want to talk about fair? Is it fair that I gave you $40,000, most of my life savings, to help you start your business, and I haven't heard from you in 2 months? Is it fair that you moved across the country without giving me a chance to say goodbye? Is it fair that you let your wife treat me like I'm invisible, like I'm some embarrassing relative you're stuck with?" "Mom, you're exaggerating. Jessica returned your father's shirt to me like it was garbage she didn't want in her house. She snuck into my apartment, went through my personal things, and decided what memories I was allowed to keep. And you let her do it. You helped her do it." I heard him take a shaky breath. "I didn't know she was going to do that. But you knew she did it. When you found out, you could have called me. You could have explained. You could have apologized. Instead, you said nothing and hoped I'd be too senile or too grateful to notice." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I found myself thinking about Harold again, about how he used to say that respect wasn't something you asked for. It was something you demanded and then earned. I'd spent so many years asking for respect, begging for it, hoping someone would grant it to me out of the goodness of their heart. But respect doesn't work that way. You have to believe you deserve it before anyone else will. I burned the shirt, I said quietly. You what? I burned it. Right here in my kitchen. I watched it turn to ash, and I felt something I haven't felt in years. Relief. Mom, that was Dad's shirt. That was a piece of fabric your wife treated like trash, and you treated like a shameful secret. It wasn't your father anymore. It was just another reminder of how little I matter to the people who are supposed to love me. I heard Jessica's voice in the background, urgent and demanding. David's voice came back muffled, like he had his hand over the phone. Look, Mom, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Maybe we should all sit down and talk this through like adults. Adults. As if I hadn't been trying to have adult conversations with him for months, only to be brushed off with excuses about business meetings and busy schedules. There's nothing to talk through, I said. I understand perfectly. You've made your choice and it's not me. That's fine. That's your right. But I'm making a choice too. What kind of choice? I'm choosing to stop chasing people who are running away from me. I'm choosing to stop sending money to children who can't be bothered to call their mother. I'm choosing to stop pretending that neglect is love and that silence is just busy schedules. Mom, don't be dramatic. We're not running away from you. Dramatic. Harold used to say that dismissing someone's feelings as drama was the cruelest thing you could do to them. It was a way of saying their pain didn't matter. Their experience wasn't valid. Their voice wasn't worth hearing. David, I said, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I love you. I will always love you. But I will not continue to humiliate myself begging for scraps of attention from someone who sees me as an obligation. You're not an obligation. Then prove it. Call me every week, not every 2 months. Visit me, not just when it's convenient for your wife. Include me in your life instead of hiding me from it. Treat me like your mother instead of like some elderly stranger you're stuck dealing with. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. It stretched on, filled with all the things we weren't saying and all the chances we'd already missed. Finally, David spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to think about this. You do that, I said. Think about it all you want. But while you're thinking, remember this. I won't be sitting here waiting indefinitely. I'm 75 years old, David. I don't have time to waste on people who don't want me in their lives. I hung up the phone before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but for the first time in months, they weren't shaking with fear or sadness. They were shaking with something that felt remarkably like freedom. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the world go by outside. Mrs. Rodriguez was hanging laundry on her fire escape, singing softly in Spanish. A group of teenagers skateboarded past, laughing and calling out to each other. An elderly man walked carefully down the sidewalk, stopping to pet every dog he encountered. Life was happening all around me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I might be part of it again. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I got dressed up. Not church dressed up, but nice enough that I felt pretty looking at myself in the mirror. I put on lipstick for the first time since Harold's funeral and walked the 6 blocks to the community center on Roosevelt Avenue. The woman at the front desk was young and cheerful, with bright purple hair and enough piercings to set off a metal detector. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking at me with genuine interest instead of the patronizing smile I'd grown used to from people who saw my age before they saw me. "I'm looking for something to do," I said. "Classes, maybe. Groups. I don't know. Something to fill my days with something other than waiting for people to call." She laughed, not mockingly but warmly. "I love your honesty. Let me show you what we've got." Her name was Carmen, and she led me through the building, pointing out different rooms and activities. There was a pottery studio where a group of women my age were chatting and laughing while they worked, a computer lab where seniors were learning to use social media, a kitchen where cooking classes were held twice a week. But what caught my attention was the art room. Through the open door, I could see easels set up around the space, canvases propped on them like windows into different worlds. Some showed landscapes, others abstract swirls of color. One showed a portrait of a little girl with pigtails, painted in soft watercolors that made her look like she was glowing from within. "That's our painting class," Carmen said, noticing where I was looking. We meet every Tuesday and Thursday from 10 to noon. It's very relaxed, very supportive. A lot of people come who've never held a paintbrush before. I thought about Harold, about how he used to doodle on the margins of his newspapers while he drank his morning coffee. Little flowers and birds and geometric patterns that meant nothing to anyone, but made him smile. I'd always said I couldn't draw a stick figure if my life depended on it, but maybe that wasn't the point. How much does it cost? I asked. $25 for the whole month, and that includes all your supplies. We also have a scholarship program if that's too much. $25. Less than what I'd been spending on coffee to make my lonely mornings feel less lonely. I'd like to try it, I said. Carmen's smile could have powered the building. Wonderful. We have a class this Thursday if you want to jump right in. And hey, if you're looking for more social stuff, we also have a knitting circle that meets Wednesday afternoons and a book club that meets Saturday mornings. A knitting circle. I hadn't knitted in years, not since David was little, and I used to make him sweaters that he'd outgrow before winter ended. My fingers still remembered how to hold needles, how to count stitches, how to turn mistakes into design features. Tell me about the knitting circle, I said. Oh, you'll love Anna, Carmen said. She runs it. Sweetest woman you'll ever meet, and she makes everyone feel welcome. They're always working on projects for charity, blankets for the homeless shelter, hats for the children's hospital, but mostly they just sit and talk and enjoy each other's company. Anna. A name that sounded like comfort, like the kind of friend I hadn't had since my neighbor Mrs. Sullivan moved to Florida 3 years ago. I signed up for both the painting class and the knitting circle, writing Margaret Patterson on the sign-up sheets in my careful handwriting. My name looked important there, like it mattered, like it belonged. Walking home, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because my problems had disappeared. David still lived 3,000 miles away. Jessica still treated me like furniture. I still lived alone in an apartment that sometimes felt more like a tomb than a home. But for the first time since Harold died, I had something to look forward to that didn't depend on other people remembering I existed. That night, my phone rang. I looked at the caller ID. David. My heart did that familiar leap it always did when I saw his name, followed immediately by the familiar twist of anxiety. What did he want? Was he calling to apologize? To argue? To tell me he was cutting me out of his life entirely? I let it ring 4 times before I answered. Hello, David. Mom. His voice sounded rough, like he hadn't slept. About yesterday. About our conversation. Yes? I've been thinking about what you said. A lot. And I need to tell you something. I sat down at my kitchen table, bracing myself for whatever was coming. Jessica doesn't want me talking to you, he said in a rush. She hasn't for a long time. She says you're too needy, too demanding. She says every conversation with you leaves me upset and distracted, and it's not fair to our marriage. The words hit like physical blows, each one landing somewhere soft and vital. But underneath the pain was something else. Relief. Finally, someone was telling me the truth. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because after we hung up yesterday, I realized something. His voice cracked slightly. I've been letting her make decisions about my relationship with you. I've been letting her decide when I call, how often I visit, what parts of my life you're allowed to be part of. And that's not who I want to be. My throat felt tight. What are you saying? I'm saying I've been a coward. I'm saying I chose the easy way instead of the right way, and I let you pay the price for it. I'm saying you deserved better from me, especially after Dad died. Tears started flowing before I could stop them. David. The shirt thing, he continued. Jessica did bring it back without asking me first. She said it was cluttering up our closet and she knew you'd want it anyway. I should have stopped her. I should have called you and explained. Instead, I let it happen and hoped you wouldn't notice. But I did notice. You always notice, Mom. That's who you are. You pay attention. You remember things. You care about details that other people overlook. And instead of appreciating that about you, we used it against you. We counted on you being too polite to call us out on our bad behavior. I closed my eyes, Harold's face appearing behind my lids. He would have been proud of this moment, proud that our son was finally stepping up to take responsibility for his actions. What happens now? I asked. Now I figure out how to be the son you raised instead of the husband Jessica wanted me to become. Now I start calling you every week, like I should have been doing all along. Now I start making decisions about our relationship based on what I want, not what's convenient for my marriage. And Jessica? A long pause. Jessica and I are going to have to work some things out. She's going to have to understand that cutting you out isn't an option anymore. And if she can't accept that, he trailed off. David, I don't want to be the reason your marriage falls apart. Mom, you're not the reason. The reason is that I married someone who thinks love is a zero-sum game, that caring about you somehow takes away from my ability to care about her. That's not how love works. That's not how family works. We talked for another hour, really talked, the way we hadn't in years. He told me about the struggles with the coffee shop, how it hadn't been as successful as they'd hoped. He told me about the loneliness of living so far from everything familiar, how Seattle rain felt different from New York rain, less like home and more like exile. He told me about the fights he and Jessica had been having, how she accused him of being distant and distracted, never realizing that distance and distraction were what happened when you forced someone to choose between love and love. I told him about the painting class I'd signed up for, about the knitting circle, about how I was learning to fill my days with things that made me happy instead of things that made me useful to other people. I told him about the nights when I'd talked to Harold's picture, asking him what I should do, how I should handle the growing distance between us. What do you think Dad would say about all this? David asked. I thought about Harold's gentle wisdom, his quiet strength, his absolute intolerance for anyone who treated family members as disposable. He'd say that love without respect is just manipulation in disguise, I said. He'd say that family isn't about who you're related to. It's about who shows up for you when showing up is hard. He'd be disappointed in me. He'd be proud that you're choosing to do better now. That's all any of us can do, David. Recognize our mistakes and decide to make different choices going forward. When we finally hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate hope I'd been clinging to. The hope that if I just waited long enough and complained little enough, everything would magically return to normal. This was different. This was hope based on action instead of wishful thinking. The next morning, I got a text message from David. Not a rushed afterthought, but a real message. Good morning, Mom. Thinking of you. Can we talk tonight around 8? I want to hear about your day. I typed back, I'd love that. I have so much to tell you. And for the first time in a long time, that was true. Thursday came bright and clear, unseasonably warm for November in Queens. I walked to the community center wearing a blue sweater Harold had always said brought out my eyes, and carrying a small purse that felt lighter than usual. No tissues for anticipated tears. No phone clutched in my hand waiting for calls that might not come. Just me, walking to do something I wanted to do, surrounded by a world that suddenly felt full of possibilities, instead of just full of disappointments. The art room was already bustling when I arrived. 8 easels were arranged in a rough circle, with paint-splattered stools positioned behind them. A table in the center held brushes of every size, tubes of paint in colors I couldn't name, and jars of water that caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows. You must be Margaret. The voice belonged to a woman about my age, with silver hair pulled back in a messy bun and paint stains on her fingers. I'm Helen, and I'm so excited you decided to join us. Carmen told me you were interested in trying something new. Helen introduced me to the others. Ruth, who was working on a painting of her late husband's garden. Jose, a retired subway conductor who specialized in cityscapes that captured the controlled chaos of New York. Maria, whose abstract paintings looked like emotions given form and color. They all welcomed me with smiles that seemed genuine, not polite. Don't worry about being perfect, Helen said, leading me to an empty easel. Nobody starts perfect. Hell, I've been painting for 15 years and I'm still not perfect. The point is to enjoy yourself and see what happens. She set me up with a basic palette: yellow, red, blue, white, black, and a few brushes. Today we're just going to play with color, she said. Mix things together, see what happens. Paint whatever comes to mind, or paint nothing specific at all. Sometimes the best art comes from not thinking too hard. I stared at the blank canvas for a long time, brush poised in my hand like a sword I wasn't sure how to wield. Around me, the others chatted comfortably while they worked, their conversations flowing naturally from painting techniques to grandchildren's report cards to favorite recipes. Finally, I dipped my brush in blue paint and made a single stroke across the white canvas. Then another. The color was deeper than I'd expected, richer. I added a touch of yellow and watched it transform into something that reminded me of summer mornings, of better times. "That's beautiful," Maria said, looking over at my hesitant attempts. "It reminds me of hope. Hope, such a small word for such a powerful feeling." I spent the next 2 hours lost in color and conversation, my hands moving without conscious thought while my mind finally, blissfully, went quiet. No worrying about whether David would call. No analyzing Jessica's latest slight. No calculating how long my money would last or whether I was becoming too much of a burden. Just blue mixing with yellow to make green. Red deepening to burgundy when I added a touch of black. White brightening everything it touched. By the time class ended, my canvas held something that might generously be called abstract art. Swirls of color that looked like they were dancing, or maybe like wind made visible. It wasn't pretty in any conventional sense, but it was mine. I had created it with my own hands, my own choices, my own vision. "Will we see you Tuesday?" Helen asked as we cleaned our brushes. "Absolutely," I said, surprising myself with how quickly the answer came. Walking home, I felt different. Not just happy, but proud. I had done something for myself, something that had nothing to do with being useful to other people or earning their approval. I had spent 2 hours being Margaret the painter instead of Margaret the abandoned mother or Margaret the grieving widow. That evening, David called exactly when he'd said he would. "How was your day, Mom?" he asked, and I could hear in his voice that he actually wanted to know. So I told him. I told him about Helen and Maria and Jose, about mixing colors and making something beautiful from nothing. I told him about how my hands remembered what it felt like to create instead of just maintain, how the morning had passed without me checking my phone once. "You sound different," he said. "Happier." I am happier. Not because my problems have gone away, but because I'm finally doing something about them instead of just waiting for them to solve themselves. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I spent 75 years taking care of other people and waiting for them to take care of me in return. And when that didn't work out the way I'd hoped, I felt sorry for myself instead of figuring out how to take care of myself. Mom, you shouldn't have to." "Yes, I should. Not instead of having people who love me, but in addition to it. I should have friends and hobbies and interests that don't depend on whether you call me or visit me or remember my birthday. I should have a life that's full enough that your absence leaves a hole instead of creating a void." There was a long pause. "Are you saying you don't need me anymore?" The question broke my heart a little, because I could hear the 8-year-old boy in it, the one who used to ask if I'd still love him if he misbehaved. "No, sweetheart. I'm saying I'm learning not to need you in ways that aren't fair to either of us. I need you to be my son, to love me and include me in your life and treat me with respect. But I don't need you to be my entire world. That's too much pressure on you and too much emptiness for me. I like this version of you," he said quietly. "You sound stronger. I feel stronger. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I have some control over my own happiness." We talked for another 45 minutes, and when we hung up, I realized something remarkable had happened. We'd had a conversation where I didn't apologize once for taking up his time or ask if he was sure he didn't need to go. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm I hadn't experienced in years. Tuesday and Thursday mornings were for painting, where I slowly learned to trust my hands and my instincts. Wednesday afternoons were for the knitting circle, where Anna turned out to be everything Carmen had promised: warm, funny, and possessed of the rare gift of making everyone feel like her favorite person. Anna was originally from Puerto Rico, but had lived in Queens for 40 years, raising 3 children who called her every day and visited every Sunday. She had the kind of easy relationship with her family that I'd always hoped to have with David, and instead of making me jealous, it gave me hope that such relationships were possible. "The trick," she told me one Wednesday as we worked on scarves for the homeless shelter, "is teaching people how to treat you from the very beginning. I made it clear to my children when they were young that family means accountability. You show up for each other. You make time for each other. You treat each other with kindness even when you're angry. But what if you didn't do that from the beginning? I asked. What if you let things slide until they became habits? Anna looked up from her knitting, needles pausing mid-stitch. Then you start now. You teach people that there's a new sheriff in town, that the old rules don't apply anymore. What if they don't like the new rules? Then you know where you stand with them. And that's valuable information, even if it's painful information. Anna had a way of making difficult truths sound like simple common sense. Over the weeks, she became not just a knitting partner, but a real friend. The kind I hadn't had since before Harold got sick, and our world shrank to the size of doctors' offices and hospital rooms. David kept his promise about calling every week. The conversations were still sometimes awkward, still sometimes strained, but they were consistent. He told me about his struggles with Jessica, how she was having difficulty adjusting to his new boundaries around me. She'd stopped speaking to him for 3 days when he'd told her he was planning to visit me for Christmas. "Are you really coming?" I asked, afraid to hope too much. "I'm really coming. Just me, not Jessica. She's not ready for that yet." The thought of seeing my son, of having him sit at my kitchen table and drink coffee from Harold's favorite mug, filled me with a joy so intense it almost felt like pain. But I also realized something that surprised me. My happiness no longer depended entirely on David's visits or phone calls. They enhanced my life, made it richer and sweeter, but they weren't the only source of meaning in my days. I had begun to build something independent of him, something that belonged to me alone. December arrived cold and full of promise. My painting had improved dramatically. I was working on a portrait of Harold from memory, trying to capture not just his face, but the kindness in his eyes, the way he smiled like he knew a secret he couldn't wait to share. It wasn't perfect, but it was getting closer to the man I remembered. The knitting circle had become like a second family. Anna and I often stayed after the others left, talking about our children and our marriages and the ways we'd learned to find contentment in unexpected places. She was teaching me to knit cables, intricate patterns that required attention and patience, but produced something beautiful and strong. David's calls had evolved from duty to pleasure. Instead of the stilted conversations we'd had for years, we were beginning to rediscover each other. He told me about books he was reading, movies he'd seen, small adventures around Seattle. I told him about my paintings, about the women in the knitting circle, about small victories like successfully using the new coffee maker Carmen had helped me pick out. "You sound like a different person, Mom," he said during one of our calls. "Happy. Independent. I'm becoming the person I forgot I could be," I said. "The person I was before I let other people's approval become more important than my own self-respect." "Are you saying I didn't approve of you?" "I'm saying I spent so much energy trying to earn approval that I forgot to approve of myself." Christmas was 2 weeks away when Jessica finally called me. I was sitting at my kitchen table working on a crossword puzzle when the phone rang. David's number appeared on the caller ID, but when I answered, it was Jessica's voice that greeted me. "Hi, Margaret. It's Jessica." "Hello," I said carefully, not sure what to expect. I wanted to talk to you about David's visit, about everything, really." She sounded different, smaller somehow, less sure of herself. "I'm listening." "I owe you an apology, a big one. The way I've treated you, the things I've said about you to David, they weren't fair. They weren't true. She paused, and I heard her take a shaky breath. "I was scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared that David would love you more than me. Scared that you'd find ways to criticize me, to point out all the ways I wasn't good enough for your son. Scared that every time he talked to you, he'd realize he could do better." Her honesty surprised me. This was not the conversation I'd expected to have. "Jessica," I said gently, "I never wanted to compete with you for David's love. I wanted to add to it. I wanted to be part of a family that included both of us. I know that now. I think I knew it then too, but I was too insecure to believe it. My own mother. She wasn't very kind to me growing up, always pointing out my flaws, always making me feel like I wasn't enough. When David talked about how wonderful you were, how much he missed you, I heard it as criticism of me instead of love for you. I thought about all the slights I'd cataloged, all the ways she'd made me feel unwelcome and unwanted. But underneath my hurt, I found something unexpected: compassion. I remembered being a young wife, desperate to prove myself worthy of Harold's love, terrified that his family would find me lacking. "I understand being scared," I said, "but fear doesn't excuse cruelty." "No, it doesn't. I was cruel to you, and I'm sorry. I'm especially sorry about the shirt. That was unforgivable." The shirt. I'd almost forgotten about Harold's shirt in the weeks since I'd burned it. So full had my days become with painting and knitting and the business of building a life worth living. "The shirt is gone," I said. "I burned it." "I know," David told me. "And I don't blame you. I would have done the same thing." We talked for another 20 minutes, and by the end of the conversation, I wouldn't say we were friends, but we weren't enemies either. She promised to work on her behavior, to try to include me instead of excluding me. I promised to give her the benefit of the doubt, to approach our relationship with hope instead of hurt. It wasn't a magical reconciliation. There would still be awkward moments, still times when old patterns of behavior threatened to resurface. But it was a beginning, and sometimes that's all you need. David arrived on December 22nd, carrying a suitcase and a sheepish smile. He looked older than he had 6 months ago, careworn but somehow more solid, like he'd finally grown into himself. "Hi, Mom," he said, and there was none of the strained politeness that had characterized our interactions for so long. Just my son, standing in my doorway, genuinely happy to see me. I hugged him tight, breathing in the scent of his cologne and the lingering smell of airplane recycled air and the indefinable essence that was purely David. My boy, taller than his father now, but still somehow small in my arms. "I missed you," I said against his shoulder. "I missed you too, more than I let myself admit." I made coffee in Harold's favorite mug, and we sat at the kitchen table where Harold and I had shared 47 years' worth of breakfasts, where I'd helped David with homework and listened to his first heartbreak and celebrated his acceptance to college. The table that had witnessed so much of our family's life that now witnessed this new beginning. "The apartment looks different," David said, looking around. "Brighter somehow." He was right. Over the past months, I'd made small changes. New curtains in a cheerful yellow, plants on the windowsill. Some of my paintings hung on the walls where Harold's old sports memorabilia used to be. The space still held Harold's memory, but it no longer felt like a shrine to the past. "I've been making some changes," I said, "trying to make this place feel more like a home for the person I am now instead of a museum for the person I used to be." David nodded, studying one of my paintings. A landscape that I'd created from memory of a park where we used to have picnics when he was little. "This is really good, Mom. I didn't know you could paint." Neither did I. Turns out there were a lot of things I didn't know about myself. We spent the afternoon catching up properly, the way we hadn't in years. He told me about the coffee shop, about how it was finally starting to turn a small profit after months of struggling. He told me about Seattle, about making friends with other business owners, about learning to love the rain that he'd initially hated. He told me about his marriage, about the work he and Jessica were doing in counseling to build healthier patterns of communication. I told him about the knitting circle, about Anna and Helen and the community I'd found at the senior center. I told him about my paintings, about therapy sessions where I was learning to set boundaries and advocate for myself. I told him about the small daily pleasures I'd discovered, the way morning light slanted through my kitchen window, the satisfaction of completing a complex knitting pattern, the peace of having a full day that didn't revolve around waiting for other people to contact me. "I'm proud of you," he said as the afternoon stretched into evening. I know that probably sounds weird, a son saying he's proud of his mother, but I am. You could have just sat here feeling sorry for yourself after Dad died, after I moved away. Instead, you built something new. I did feel sorry for myself for a while, I admitted, longer than I should have, but eventually I realized that self-pity wasn't getting me anywhere. It wasn't bringing your father back or bringing you back. It was just making me smaller and sadder every day. What changed? I thought about Harold's shirt, about the moment I'd stood in my kitchen and decided I was done accepting crumbs, about the first painting class, the first knitting circle, the first time I'd answered David's call without anxiety clutching at my chest. I remembered that I'm a person, not just a role, I'm not just your mother or Harold's widow. I'm Margaret, and Margaret deserves a life that's full and meaningful and joyful, even when the people she loves most aren't physically present. That evening, David helped me cook dinner, Harold's favorite pot roast recipe that I hadn't made since he died, because cooking for one had felt too sad, and cooking Harold's favorites had felt too lonely. But cooking with David, laughing as he tried to remember which spice went where, felt like reclaiming a piece of our family's history instead of mourning it. We talked until nearly midnight, the conversation flowing the way it had when he was young and would sneak downstairs to tell me about his day long after his official bedtime. I went to bed that night feeling full in a way I hadn't in months, not just from the food, but from connection, from being seen and heard and valued by someone who mattered to me. David stayed for 5 days, and each one was a gift. We visited the neighborhood where he'd grown up, walking past his old school and the playground where I'd pushed him on swings until my arms ached. We went to the art supply store where he bought me a professional set of paints and brushes that must have cost more than he could really afford. "You don't need to buy me things," I told him. "Your being here is enough." "I know I don't need to," he said. "I want to. I want to support this new thing you're building, this new version of yourself." On Christmas Eve, we attended midnight mass at the church Harold and I had belonged to for 30 years. Father Miguel, who had known David since he was a boy, welcomed him back with genuine warmth. After the service, parishioners I hadn't spoken to in months stopped to chat, to meet my son, to ask about my painting and my knitting. "You sure have become popular," David teased as we walked home through the quiet streets, Christmas lights twinkling in windows and snow beginning to dust the sidewalks. "I became visible again," I corrected. "When you're depressed and isolated, you become invisible even to people who care about you. They don't know how to help, so they stop trying. But when you show up for life, people can see you again." Christmas morning, David gave me a photo album he'd made on his computer, pictures from his childhood, from family vacations, from holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesdays that had somehow become precious in hindsight. The last page held a recent photo of himself, smiling in front of his coffee shop, with a handwritten note. "For Mom, who taught me that love means showing up even when it's hard. Thank you for never giving up on us." I gave him a scarf I'd knitted, my first successful cable pattern, worked in deep blue wool the color of Harold's eyes. He tried it on immediately and declared it the most beautiful scarf he'd ever owned. But the real gift was the conversation we had later that morning, sitting by the window with our coffee, watching the neighborhood wake up to Christmas. "I want to establish some new traditions," David said. "I want to call you every Sunday, not just when I remember or when I feel guilty. I want to visit every few months, not just when major holidays force the issue. I want you to come to Seattle in the spring, to see the shop and meet my friends and let me show you my life instead of just telling you about it. And Jessica? Jessica is working hard to become the kind of person who can handle those traditions. If she can't," he shrugged. "Marriage is important, but it shouldn't require cutting off your family. Dad taught me that. Your father would be so proud of the man you're becoming," I said. "I hope so. I know he'd be proud of the woman you've become." David left on December 27th, but his departure didn't feel like abandonment this time. It felt like the natural conclusion to a visit, with concrete plans for the future instead of vague promises to keep in touch. He would call on Sunday. He would visit in March. I would plan a trip to Seattle for April, something I hadn't thought possible when my days revolved around waiting for other people to include me in their plans. I cried when he left, but they were sweet tears instead of bitter ones. Tears of gratitude instead of grief. January arrived cold and bright, full of possibility. I started a new painting, a self-portrait, something I'd never attempted before. Not a photorealistic representation, but something that captured the essence of who I was becoming. A woman with silver hair and laugh lines and paint-stained fingers, and eyes that looked forward instead of backward. The knitting circle resumed after the holiday break, and Anna welcomed me back with a hug that smelled like vanilla and cinnamon from her Christmas baking. "You look different," she said, studying my face. "Lighter. I feel different. Like I remembered how to be myself instead of just existing in reaction to other people." She nodded knowingly. It's amazing what happens when you stop waiting for other people to give you permission to live your life. That afternoon, as I worked on a baby blanket for Anna's newest grandchild, I reflected on the past months. The journey from that terrible day when I'd found Harold's shirt hidden in my closet to this moment, surrounded by friends and working on something beautiful with my hands, felt like traveling between two different worlds. In the old world, I had measured my worth by how much other people needed me, how useful I could make myself, how little trouble I could cause. I had accepted neglect as normal, cruelty as misunderstanding, abandonment as busy schedules. I had shrunk myself down to fit into whatever small space other people were willing to give me. In this new world, I measured my worth by how fully I could live, how much beauty I could create, how much joy I could find in ordinary moments. I expected respect as a basic requirement, kindness as non-negotiable, inclusion as the price of admission to my life. I had expanded to fill the space I deserved. The transition hadn't been easy. There had been lonely nights when I'd questioned whether demanding better treatment was worth the risk of losing relationships entirely. There had been moments of doubt when I wondered if I was being too harsh, too demanding, too selfish. But every Sunday when David called, every Tuesday and Thursday when I lost myself in painting, every Wednesday when Anna and the others welcomed me with genuine affection, I was reminded that respect and love weren't mutually exclusive, that healthy relationships required both. February brought news that Jessica was pregnant. David called to tell me, his voice a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "How do you feel about being a grandmother?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. For so many months, I'd felt like I was barely holding on to my role as mother. The idea that I might expand into grandmother felt almost too good to believe. "Thrilled," I said. "Terrified. Grateful. How do you feel about being a father?" "All of those things. And determined to do better than I have been. I don't want my child to ever question whether they matter to me." "They won't," I said, with confidence I genuinely felt. "You've learned too much to repeat those mistakes. I want you to be part of this baby's life from the beginning. Real involvement, not just birthday cards and Christmas presents. Jessica wants that too." "She does?" "She says she wants our child to have the kind of grandmother who shows up, who's present and involved and loving. She says she wishes she'd had that growing up." I thought about the grandmothers I'd known growing up. Women who baked cookies and told stories and created safe spaces away from the complications of adult life. Women who spoiled their grandchildren just enough and loved them unconditionally. "I'd like that very much," I said. "Good. Because we want you to come out for the birth, to stay with us for a couple of weeks afterward, help with the baby, be part of those first precious days." The invitation was everything I'd hoped for and more. Not just tolerance, but genuine welcome. Not just inclusion, but celebration. March arrived with David's promised visit, and this time Jessica came with him. My anxiety about seeing her again had built up over the weeks, despite our phone conversation and her promises to do better. Old wounds heal slowly, and trust, once broken, requires time and consistency to rebuild. But when she walked into my apartment, she looked different. Softer somehow, more vulnerable. Her pregnancy was just beginning to show, a small curve that she rested her hand on protectively. "Hi, Margaret," she said, and her smile reached her eyes for the first time I could remember. "Hello, Jessica. Congratulations on the baby." "Thank you. I brought you something." She handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a framed photograph. David as a little boy, sitting on Harold's shoulders at what looked like a carnival or fair. Both of them were grinning at the camera, cotton candy sticky on their faces. "I found this in some old photos," Jessica explained. "I thought you might like to have it." The gesture was simple but significant, not trying to erase Harold's memory or minimize his importance, but acknowledging his place in our family's history. "This is beautiful," I said, genuinely touched. "Thank you." The weekend wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, still conversations that felt stilted, still evidence of the work we all needed to do to rebuild trust and establish new patterns. But it was honest, and it was hopeful, and it was a beginning. Jessica asked to see my paintings, and her interest seemed genuine rather than polite. She spent a long time looking at the portrait of Harold I'd been working on, studying the details I'd labored over. "You've captured something about him," she said finally. "Not just how he looked, but how he felt. He looks kind. He was kind. Above everything else, he was kind. David gets that from him, I think. The kindness. It's one of the things I love most about your son." It was the first conversation we'd had where we connected over our shared love for David rather than competed for it. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. During their visit, I took them to the community center to meet Anna and see the art room where I'd been spending so much time. Helen was there, working on a seascape, and she welcomed David and Jessica like they were her own family. "Your mother has become quite the artist," Helen told David. "She has a real eye for color and composition." I watched David's face as he looked at my latest painting, the self-portrait I'd been working on for weeks. His expression was thoughtful, impressed, proud. "I keep learning new things about you, Mom," he said. "We're never too old to surprise ourselves," I replied. April came softly, with cherry blossoms blooming along the subway line and hope warming the air like an early heat wave. My trip to Seattle was scheduled for the third week of the month, and I found myself looking forward to it with excitement rather than anxiety. Not desperation disguised as anticipation, but genuine curiosity about David's life and confidence that I would be welcome in it. Anna helped me pack, giving advice about Seattle weather and airplane comfort and the art supplies I should bring to document my adventure. "You're glowing," she said, as we folded clothes into my new suitcase, a Christmas gift from myself to myself. "You look like a woman going on vacation instead of a woman going to beg for approval." "I feel like a woman going to visit her son," I said. "Not to fix anything or prove anything or earn anything, just to be present for someone I love who also loves me." The difference was profound. Seattle surprised me with its beauty. David met me at the airport, and as we drove through the city, he pointed out landmarks with the pride of someone who had made a place truly home. The coffee shop was small but charming, with exposed brick walls and mismatched furniture that somehow worked together perfectly. A chalkboard menu listed drinks with names like The Optimist and Rainy Day Revival. Photos of local artists' work, including some by customers, decorated the walls. "We've become a bit of a community gathering place," David explained. "People come here to work, to meet friends, to attend our Friday night poetry readings." Poetry readings. My pragmatic son had created a space for artists and dreamers. Harold would have been amazed. I stayed for 10 days, and each one revealed new facets of the life David had built. He had indeed made friends, other business owners, regular customers who knew his name and asked about his family, a book club that met every other Tuesday evening at the shop. Jessica had friends too, women from her pregnancy yoga class who included me in their conversations naturally, without the forced politeness I'd expected. We visited Pike Place Market, where David bought ingredients for Harold's pot roast recipe, which he'd learned to make himself. We walked through neighborhoods where cherry trees dropped petals like confetti, where street musicians played for tips and tourists and the sheer joy of making music. We rode the ferry across Elliott Bay, standing at the railing and watching seagulls dive for fish while the city skyline grew smaller behind us. But the best moments were the quiet ones. Morning coffee before the shop opened. Just the two of us talking about everything and nothing. Evening walks around their neighborhood. Jessica pointing out houses with gardens she admired, making plans for the flower boxes she wanted to install at the coffee shop. Dinner conversations that flowed naturally from topic to topic. No one checking their phone or making excuses to leave early. One evening, as we sat on their tiny balcony watching the sunset, paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Jessica said something that surprised me. "I owe you an apology that I haven't given you yet," she said. "Not for the specific things I did wrong, but for the person I was when I did them." "What do you mean?" "I mean I was so insecure, so afraid of not being enough, that I tried to make myself bigger by making other people smaller. Especially you. I felt threatened by how much David loved you, how much you meant to him, and instead of trying to understand that love or find my place alongside it, I tried to diminish it." She paused, rubbing her growing belly absently. "I'm going to be a mother soon," she continued. And the idea that someday my child might have to choose between loving me and loving someone else they care about, it breaks my heart. I never want to be the kind of person who forces those choices. We all make mistakes when we're afraid, I said gently. The important thing is learning from them. I want to learn from them. I want to do better. I want my child to grow up in a family where love multiplies instead of divides, where having more people to care about is a blessing instead of a threat. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city lights begin to twinkle as darkness fell. David was inside, washing dishes and humming off-key, completely unconscious of how perfect this ordinary moment was. "Thank you," Jessica said finally. "For what?" "For not giving up on us completely. For fighting for your relationship with David instead of just walking away. For showing us what it looks like to demand respect while still offering love." I thought about Harold's shirt, about the moment I'd decided I was done accepting less than I deserved. It had felt like an ending then, like burning bridges, but it had actually been a beginning, the first step toward building something better. "I almost did walk away," I admitted. "There were moments when it would have been easier to just accept that this was how things were going to be." "What stopped you?" I considered the question carefully. I realized that walking away wouldn't prove anything except that I'd given up on people I loved, but demanding better treatment, that was a way of fighting for us, not against us. "I want to remember that," Jessica said. "When my child is older, when relationships get complicated, I want to remember that fighting for someone and fighting with someone aren't the same thing." My last morning in Seattle, David and I went for one final walk through Pike Place Market. We bought coffee from a vendor who knew David by name and sat on a bench overlooking the Sound, watching ferries carve their way through water that sparkled like scattered diamonds. "I'm glad you came," David said. "I'm glad we figured out how to find each other again." "We never lost each other," I said. "We just forgot how to see each other clearly." "Are you happy, Mom? Really happy? Not just making the best of things happy?" I thought about the question seriously. Happiness felt like such a simple word for such a complex state of being. "I'm content," I said finally. "I have people I love who love me back. I have activities that challenge and fulfill me. I have a future that feels full of possibility instead of just full of dread. I miss your father every day, but his absence doesn't define my entire existence anymore." That sounds like happiness to me. Maybe it is. I think I'd forgotten what happiness felt like when it wasn't dependent on other people's choices. The flight home was smooth and peaceful, and as Manhattan's skyline came into view, I felt something I hadn't expected. Genuine joy at returning to my own life. Not just relief at escaping scrutiny or awkwardness, but excitement about getting back to my painting and my knitting circle and my own routine. Anna met me at my apartment with a casserole and a dozen questions about my trip. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd once sat alone, waiting for phone calls that rarely came, and I told her about Seattle's beauty, about David's success, about Jessica's growth, about the grandchild who would arrive in 5 months. "You look like a woman who's been on vacation," Anna observed, refreshed, renewed. I feel renewed. Not because everything is perfect now, but because everything is honest. No one is pretending to feel things they don't feel or hiding resentments behind polite smiles. We're all working with the truth instead of working around it. Truth is easier to live with than lies, even when truth is harder to hear. Anna was full of wisdom like that. Simple observations that contained lifetimes of experience. May brought my 76th birthday, and for the first time in 2 years, it didn't feel like a day to be survived, but a day to be celebrated. David and Jessica called first thing in the morning, both of them on the phone at the same time, singing an off-key but enthusiastic version of Happy Birthday. The knitting circle threw me a small party at the community center, complete with a chocolate cake Helen had baked herself and small gifts from each of the members, a set of enamel painting palette knives, a book of knitting patterns, a silk scarf in my favorite shade of blue. But the gift that meant the most was the one I gave myself, permission to be proud of how far I'd come. A year ago, I'd been a woman waiting for other people to remember I existed. Now I was a woman whose existence was too full and rich and meaningful to be reduced to someone else's memory or neglect. I had friends who valued my company, hobbies that challenged my mind, and a relationship with my son that was built on mutual respect instead of obligation or guilt. I thought about Harold often, but the memories no longer felt like prison bars keeping me trapped in the past. They felt like treasures I could visit when I wanted comfort or guidance, then put away again when it was time to focus on the present. The baby, a girl they'd decided to name Grace, was due in August. David sent photos from Jessica's ultrasound appointments, grainy black and white images that somehow captured the miracle of a new life taking shape. They'd asked me to be in the delivery room, to be one of the first people to hold their daughter. "I want Grace to know her grandmother from the very beginning," Jessica had said during one of our increasingly comfortable phone conversations. "I want her to understand that she comes from a long line of strong women who don't give up when things get hard. Strong women who don't give up." Was that how she saw me now? Was that how I saw myself? I painted Grace's nursery during my June visit to Seattle, a mural of flowers and butterflies and sunshine that would welcome her into a world full of color and possibility. Jessica stood beside me, one hand on her growing belly, making suggestions and asking questions about technique. "I never knew you were artistic," she said. "Neither did I, until I gave myself permission to try." What else don't you know about yourself?" It was a beautiful question, one that implied endless potential for discovery and growth. "I guess we'll find out," I said. Grace arrived on a sweltering Tuesday in August, after 18 hours of labor that left Jessica exhausted but triumphant, and David crying tears of joy and overwhelm. I held my granddaughter when she was less than an hour old, her tiny fingers wrapped around mine, her eyes trying to focus on my face. She was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair that reminded me of David as a newborn. But more than her physical perfection, she represented hope, proof that love could grow and multiply and create new possibilities instead of just recycling old patterns. "Hello, sweet girl," I whispered to her as she slept in my arms. "I'm your grandmother, and I have been waiting so long to meet you." I stayed for 3 weeks, helping with middle-of-the-night feedings, cooking meals while Jessica recovered, holding Grace so her parents could shower and nap and remember they were still individuals as well as parents. It was the kind of hands-on grandmothering I'd dreamed of, the kind that builds bonds through daily care and presence instead of just holiday visits and birthday cards. The night before I flew home to New York, Jessica and I sat together in Grace's nursery while the baby slept in her crib, surrounded by the flowers I'd painted on her walls. "Thank you," Jessica said softly, "not just for the help these past weeks, but for fighting for us when it would have been easier to give up. I know that sounds weird, but your refusal to accept being treated badly forced all of us to do better." "I didn't fight for you," I said gently. "I fought for me. The fact that it helped us all was just a happy side effect. What's the difference? When you fight for other people, you're asking them to change for your sake, which puts you at their mercy. When you fight for yourself, you're declaring that you deserve better regardless of whether they're willing to give it to you. It's much more powerful." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "I want to teach Grace that. I want her to know she deserves respect and kindness, not to hope for it or beg for it, but to expect it as her baseline. Then you'll raise a strong woman." "I hope so. I want her to be strong like you, strong like me." The words would have seemed impossible a year ago, when strength felt like something other people possessed, something I'd lost somewhere along the way. Now I understood that strength wasn't something you either had or didn't have. It was something you chose, over and over again, in small moments and big ones. Flying home with Grace's scent still lingering on my clothes, I felt a contentment deeper than anything I'd experienced since Harold's death. Not because all my problems had been solved or all my relationships had been perfected, but because I'd learned to build happiness from the inside out instead of waiting for it to be delivered from somewhere else. The apartment welcomed me back like an old friend. Plants Helen had watered in my absence were thriving on the windowsill. New paintings I'd started before leaving waited on easels for my return. A stack of messages from Anna and other friends from the knitting circle sat on my kitchen table, evidence of a social network that existed independently of family obligation. I made myself a cup of coffee in Harold's favorite mug and sat at the kitchen table, looking out the window at the neighborhood I'd lived in for 45 years. Mrs. Rodriguez was hanging laundry on her fire escape, and she waved when she saw me in the window, calling out a cheerful, "Welcome home." The teenagers who congregated on the corner looked familiar now instead of threatening. The morning sounds of buses and sirens and life beginning had become the soundtrack of my contentment instead of the background noise of my loneliness. I opened my laptop, a recent purchase that had taken weeks of community center computer classes to master, and began typing an email to update my friends about Grace's arrival and my visit. As I wrote, I realized I was documenting not just a trip, but a transformation. The woman who'd written this email was fundamentally different from the woman who'd found Harold's shirt in her closet 14 months earlier. That woman had measured her worth by how much other people needed her, how little trouble she caused, how gracefully she could accept scraps of attention. This woman measured her worth by how fully she lived, how much beauty she created, how boldly she claimed space in her own life. The journey between those two versions of myself hadn't been easy. There had been dark nights when I'd questioned whether demanding respect was worth the risk of losing relationships entirely. There had been lonely moments when I'd wondered if I was being too hard, too demanding, too selfish in my expectations. But every Sunday when David called with news and questions and genuine interest in my life, every Wednesday when Anna hugged me hello at Knitting Circle, every morning when I woke up excited about the day ahead instead of dreading another stretch of empty hours, I was reminded that respect and love weren't mutually exclusive, that healthy relationships required both. October brought news that David and Jessica were planning to expand the coffee shop, adding a small gallery space to showcase local artists' work. They asked if I'd be interested in participating in the grand opening exhibition. "Really?" I asked, hardly able to believe they thought my amateur paintings were gallery-worthy. "Really," David said. "Your work has gotten so good, Mom. Plus, you'd be our featured grandmother artist. Marketing gold." I laughed at his pragmatism, but underneath the joking was something more meaningful. Recognition. Not just tolerance of my hobby, but genuine appreciation for my growth as an artist and a person. I chose 3 paintings for the show. The self-portrait I'd been working on for months, finally completed. A landscape of Flushing Meadows Park where Harold and I had walked almost every Sunday for decades. And a new piece I'd started after Grace's birth, an abstract representation of hope that captured the swirls of joy and possibility I felt when I looked at my granddaughter. The opening was scheduled for November 15th. I flew to Seattle a week early to help with preparations and spend time with Grace, who at 3 months old was already showing signs of Harold's temperament. Calm, observant, quick to smile. "She's going to be an artist like her grandmother," Jessica said, watching Grace stare in fascination at the mobile of painted butterflies hanging above her changing table. "She's going to be whatever she wants to be," I corrected gently. "That's the best gift we can give her, the knowledge that she has choices." The night before the gallery opening, I couldn't sleep, not from anxiety, but from a kind of electric excitement I hadn't felt since I was young. I was going to show my work to strangers, to stand in a room and hear what other people thought of the images I'd created from my own vision and experience. Harold would have been so proud. When we were first married, I'd mentioned wanting to take art classes someday, but life had intervened. His job, my job, David's needs, the endless practical requirements of building a household and raising a family. Art had seemed like a luxury we couldn't afford, a dream that could wait for some theoretical future when we had more time and money and energy. That future had never come. Harold had died without ever seeing me paint anything more ambitious than the bathroom walls. But somehow I felt his presence as I stood in front of the mirror in David and Jessica's guest room, putting on lipstick and the new blue dress I'd bought specially for the occasion. "I did it, Harold," I whispered to my reflection. "I finally did it." The gallery opening exceeded my wildest expectations. David had invited what seemed like half of Seattle, customers from the coffee shop, other local business owners, friends from his book club, Jessica's yoga classmates and co-workers. The space looked professional and sophisticated, with proper lighting and small placards next to each piece describing the artist and the inspiration behind the work. My 3 paintings hung in a place of honor near the entrance, and I watched nervously as strangers stopped to study them, some making comments I couldn't quite overhear. A young woman spent 10 minutes examining my self-portrait, her expression thoughtful and engaged. An elderly couple debated the meaning of my hope painting. their conversation animated and passionate. "Looks like you have some admirers," Anna's voice said behind me. I turned to find her approaching with a warm smile and open arms. "Anna, what are you doing here? Did you really think I'd miss your debut as a famous artist? I flew out this morning. David arranged everything." David, who had thought to include the friend who'd been such an important part of my transformation, who'd understood that sharing this moment with Anna would make it even more meaningful. The evening was magical. People asked thoughtful questions about my technique and inspiration. A local art critic spent 20 minutes discussing my use of color and composition, treating me like a serious artist worthy of critical attention. Several people asked if my work was for sale, if I took commissions, if I taught classes. But the moment that mattered most came near the end of the evening, when Grace began to fuss in her stroller, and I volunteered to walk her around the gallery to soothe her. As I pushed the stroller slowly past the paintings and sculptures, Grace's crying subsided, replaced by the wide-eyed alertness she showed when something captured her attention. When we stopped in front of my Hope painting, she stared at it with the kind of focused concentration usually reserved for faces or bright toys. "What do you think, sweet girl?" I asked her softly. "Do you like grandmother's painting?" She gurgled what I chose to interpret as approval. Standing there in that gallery, surrounded by people who appreciated beauty and creativity, holding my granddaughter while she studied art I'd created with my own hands, I felt a completeness I'd never experienced before. Not the desperate completion that comes from getting external validation, but the deep satisfaction that comes from living authentically, from using your time and energy in ways that reflect your values and feed your soul. The flight home was bittersweet. I was sad to leave Grace and David and Jessica, sad to end such a perfect week. But I was also eager to get back to my own life, to the painting projects waiting in my apartment, to the knitting circle where I could share stories and photos from my adventure. Anna flew back with me, and we spent the cross-country journey planning my next artistic challenge, a series of portraits of the women from our knitting circle, each one capturing not just physical likeness but personality and spirit. "You know what I love most about your transformation?" Anna said as the plane began its descent into JFK. "What? You didn't become a different person. You became more yourself. The creativity, the strength, the love, all of that was already there. You just learned to trust it instead of hiding it. Trust it instead of hiding it." Anna's words stayed with me during the weeks that followed, as I settled back into my routine of painting and knitting and living fully. She was right. I hadn't become someone new. I'd finally become who I'd always been underneath the fear and people-pleasing and desperate need for approval. December brought David's call with news that they were planning to visit for Christmas. All three of them, including 4-month-old Grace. My apartment, which had once felt too empty and too full of ghosts, was about to be filled with the laughter and chaos of a young family. I prepared with the enthusiasm of someone who knew she was truly wanted, not just tolerated. I bought a crib and baby supplies and ingredients for all of David's favorite Christmas cookies. I hung Grace's ultrasound photos on the refrigerator next to my latest paintings. I filled the apartment with evidence of the life I'd built, art supplies and yarn projects and photographs from my gallery opening. Christmas morning, as I watched David help Grace tear wrapping paper off presents she was too young to care about while Jessica documented every moment with her camera, I felt Harold's presence more strongly than I had since he died. Not the aching absence that had characterized the first year of grief, but a warm sense of continuity, of love that transcends physical presence. "I wish Dad could see this," David said, echoing my thoughts as he held Grace up to look at the Christmas tree lights. "I think he can," I said simply. "I think he's been watching all along, waiting for us to find our way back to each other." "Maybe that's what the shirt was about," Jessica said unexpectedly. "Maybe he made sure it ended up back with you because he knew it would force all of us to stop avoiding the truth and start dealing with it." The shirt. I'd almost forgotten about Harold's shirt, the moment that had started this whole journey. What had felt like the end of something at the time had actually been the beginning, the first crack in the wall I'd built around my pain, the first ray of light in what had seemed like permanent darkness. "Maybe," I agreed. "Your father always did have a way of making sure important things didn't go unnoticed." That afternoon, as David napped on the couch with Grace sleeping on his chest and Jessica curled up in the armchair reading, I sat at my kitchen table working on a new painting, a family portrait that captured not just how we looked, but how we felt. Connected, complete, content. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, dusting the fire escapes and sidewalks with the kind of pristine beauty that makes even queens look magical. Mrs. Rodriguez's grandchildren were building a snowman in the courtyard, their Spanish and English mixing in joyful shouts of excitement. I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, sitting at this same table on Christmas afternoon, alone and forgotten and convinced that her best days were behind her. If I could send that woman a message, what would I tell her? That strength isn't about enduring mistreatment gracefully, but about believing you deserve better and acting accordingly. That love multiplies when it's shared freely instead of hoarded desperately. That it's never too late to discover new parts of yourself, to take up space in your own life, to demand respect while still offering kindness. That happiness isn't something other people give you. It's something you create for yourself, one choice at a time, one boundary at a time, one brave moment at a time. Evening came softly, bringing with it the comfortable chaos of a family dinner. Grace fussed through most of the meal, requiring passes between all 3 adults before finally settling down in my arms. As I swayed gently back and forth, humming the lullaby my mother used to sing to me, I caught David watching us with an expression of pure contentment. "You're a natural grandmother," he said. "I'm a natural Margaret," I corrected. "Grandmother is just one of the roles I get to play now." After Jessica and David went to bed, I stayed up late finishing Grace's Christmas stocking, a complex pattern of snowflakes and reindeer that had taken me weeks to complete. As I worked by lamplight, the apartment quiet except for the soft sounds of my family sleeping, I felt a peace deeper than anything I'd known since Harold was alive. Not the peace of resignation or acceptance of mediocrity, but the peace that comes from living authentically, from surrounding yourself with people who see your worth and celebrate your growth, from knowing that your days are filled with purpose and beauty and love that flows both ways. The new year arrived with champagne toasts and resolutions and hope for the future. David and Jessica flew back to Seattle with promises to return for Easter, plans for me to visit in the spring when Grace would be old enough to travel more easily, discussions of family traditions we wanted to establish and maintain. I started the year with a commission, my first paid artwork, requested by one of the people who'd seen my paintings at the gallery opening, a portrait of an elderly man's late wife, to be painted from photographs and memories, and love that death couldn't diminish. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work I'd dreamed of doing, art that served not just aesthetic purposes, but emotional ones. The knitting circle resumed after the holiday break, and I shared stories of Christmas with Grace, showing photos and videos that made Anna and the others coo with appropriate grandmotherly enthusiasm. But our conversations weren't limited to family updates. We discussed books we'd read, movies we'd seen, places we wanted to travel, dreams we still hoped to pursue. We were a group of women who'd learned that life doesn't end when your children grow up, or your spouse dies, or your body starts showing signs of wear. We'd learned that every stage of life offers new possibilities, new sources of joy, new ways to grow and contribute and matter. Spring brought the visit to Seattle I'd been anticipating for months. Grace, now 8 months old, had developed a personality, curious, determined, quick to laugh, slow to forgive when something didn't go her way. She'd also developed a clear preference for her grandmother's arms when she was tired or cranky, a bond that filled me with pride and purpose. "She knows quality when she sees it," Jessica joked one afternoon, as Grace settled contentedly in my lap while rejecting her mother's attempts to soothe her. "She knows I have all the time in the world for her," I corrected. "That's a luxury grandmothers can offer that parents sometimes can't." David's coffee shop had expanded again, adding a small bookstore section and hosting author readings twice a month. My paintings had sold surprisingly well during my November show, and David had asked if I'd be interested in hanging a new collection for their spring exhibition. "I'd be honored," I said, meaning it completely. The pieces I chose for the spring show were different from my first exhibition. More confident, more technically accomplished, more emotionally complex. There was a series inspired by Grace's expressions and gestures, capturing the wonder of seeing the world through infant eyes. A landscape of the view from their apartment balcony, painted during different times of day to show how light transforms familiar spaces. A still life of Harold's coffee mug filled with paintbrushes, a meditation on how old loves can nurture new passions. The opening was smaller than the November event, but no less satisfying. I found myself discussing technique with other artists, offering advice to beginners, accepting invitations to participate in group shows and charity auctions. I was becoming part of Seattle's art community, claim a place in my son's chosen city that existed independently of family obligation. But the most meaningful moment came when a young woman approached me near the end of the evening. "Excuse me?" she said shyly. "Are you the artist who painted the grandmother series?" "I am. I just wanted to thank you. My own grandmother died last year, and she was a lot like the woman in your paintings. Strong but gentle, patient but dignified. Looking at your work reminded me of all the things I loved about her, and all the things I want to carry forward from her example." Tears gathered in my eyes as she spoke. This was why art mattered, not just for the creator's satisfaction, but for the connections it could forge between human experiences, the way it could help people feel less alone in their grief or joy or complicated relationships with love and loss. "Thank you for telling me that," I said. "That means more than you could possibly know." The flight home was peaceful and reflective. I'd spent 3 weeks living in my son's world, participating in his community, contributing to his success. But instead of feeling like a burden or an obligation, I'd felt like a valued addition, someone whose presence enhanced rather than disrupted the life he'd built. Summer arrived with news that Jessica was pregnant again, a surprise that sent both parents into happy panic about managing a coffee shop, a toddler, and a newborn simultaneously. "We're going to need all the family help we can get," David said during our Sunday call. Family help. Not just emergency backup or occasional assistance, but integral support from people who belonged in their lives. I was already making plans to spend several weeks with them after the new baby's arrival, already knitting blankets and booties in gender-neutral yellows and greens. Grace's first birthday party was scheduled for August, and I was planning my longest visit yet to Seattle. 6 weeks that would include the party, help with Jessica's advancing pregnancy, and quality time with my granddaughter before her world changed with the arrival of a sibling. The knitting circle threw me a small farewell party the week before I left, presenting me with a travel bag they'd all worked together to create. Each section was knitted in a different pattern, but the same soft blue yarn, creating something unified but uniquely individual. "For all your adventures," Anna said as I opened the gift. Adventures. Such a perfect word for what my life had become. Not the passive endurance I'd once mistaken for strength, but active engagement with possibility and growth and joy. The 6 weeks in Seattle flew by in a blur of birthday preparations, baby preparations, and the daily pleasures of being intimately involved in Grace's development. She was walking now, though unsteadily, and had begun to show signs of artistic inclination, fascination with colors, delight in making marks on paper, an uncanny ability to find beauty in unexpected places. "She's definitely your granddaughter," David observed one afternoon as Grace spent 20 minutes arranging and rearranging colored blocks in patterns that seemed meaningful to her, if to no one else. "She's definitely herself," I corrected, but I felt a warm pride in the similarity Anna and others had noted between Grace's focused intensity and my own. The birthday party was everything a 1-year-old's celebration should be. Chaos and cake and more presents than any child could possibly need. But watching Grace's delighted confusion at being the center of so much attention, seeing how many people had come to celebrate her first year of life, I was struck by how different her experience was from what mine had been at her age, or even what David's had been. She was growing up knowing she was cherished not just by her parents, but by extended family and chosen family and community members who saw her as important and valuable. She was developing in an environment where love was abundant rather than scarce, where attention was freely given rather than carefully rationed. The contrast made me both sad and hopeful. Sad for the childhood I'd had, and even the motherhood I'd experienced, but hopeful for Grace and the new baby and the family structures we were creating together. Jessica went into early labor 2 weeks before her due date, on a Tuesday morning while I was teaching Grace to finger paint at the kitchen table. The contractions came fast and intense, and we barely made it to the hospital before James Harold Patterson, named for both his grandfathers, made his dramatic entrance into the world. He was smaller than Grace had been, more fragile-seeming, but with the same alert eyes and determined chin that marked him as clearly part of our family. Holding him in the hospital room while Jessica slept and David called relatives with the good news, I felt the profound satisfaction of being exactly where I belonged at exactly the right moment. Not invited out of obligation or guilt, but welcomed out of love and genuine need for my presence. Not tolerated as a necessary burden, but celebrated as an essential part of the family team. I stayed for 3 more weeks, helping David manage the coffee shop while juggling new parent exhaustion, teaching Grace how to be gentle with her baby brother, cooking meals and doing laundry, and providing the kind of practical support that new families desperately need. But I also made sure to maintain my own identity during those busy weeks. I painted early in the mornings before the household woke up, capturing fleeting moments of domestic beauty, Grace's hand on James's head, Jessica nursing while reading to her daughter, David making coffee with a baby strapped to his chest. I video called Anna and the knitting circle to share updates and maintain connections to my own community. I was fully present for my family's needs without losing myself in them, a balance I'd never achieved when David was young, when I'd defined myself entirely through my roles as wife and mother. The flight home in September was bittersweet, but not tragic. I missed Grace and James and David and Jessica, but I was also eager to return to my own life, my own projects, my own friendships. The missing was evidence of love rather than evidence of dependence, connection rather than desperation. My apartment welcomed me back with familiar comfort. The plants Helen had watered were thriving. My easel stood ready with a half-finished painting I was excited to complete, and a stack of messages from friends proved that I'd been missed and thought of during my absence. I'd been gone long enough to gain perspective on how much my life had changed in the 3 years since Harold's death. The woman who'd found his shirt hidden in her closet had been lost, desperate, willing to accept any treatment that didn't involve complete abandonment. The woman who'd returned from 6 weeks of being genuinely needed and appreciated was found, confident, surrounded by people who chose her company because they enjoyed it rather than because they were obligated to tolerate it. October brought an unexpected opportunity, an invitation to teach a beginning painting class at the community center. Carmen, who'd been so helpful during my own early days there, had noticed how naturally I worked with other seniors who were hesitant about trying art for the first time. "You have a gift for making people feel like they can do things they never thought possible," she said when she offered me the position. "That's a rare talent, and we'd love to put it to work helping other people discover their creativity." Teaching. It had never occurred to me that I might have something valuable to offer in a formal instructional setting, but as I considered Carmen's proposal, I realized it made perfect sense. I understood the fear of starting something new late in life, the vulnerability of expressing yourself creatively after decades of focusing on practical concerns, the joy of discovering capabilities you never knew you had. My first class was small, 6 women and 2 men, all over 60, all carrying some version of the same story I'd brought to my first painting session: loneliness after a spouse's death, emptiness after children moved away, a sense that their interesting, creative years were behind them instead of still available. "I've never been artistic," said Margaret. Yes, another Margaret, which made us both laugh during our first session. "Neither had I replied honestly. But it turns out that not being artistic yet and not being artistic ever are completely different things. Watching my students' faces as they made their first tentative brush strokes, seeing their amazement when colors mixed in unexpected ways, witnessing their growing confidence as weeks passed, it was as satisfying as creating my own art, maybe more so. Teaching also introduced me to new techniques and perspectives as I researched lessons and activities. I started experimenting with watercolors, with pastels, with mixed media projects that combined painting and collage. My own work became more adventurous, more playful, less constrained by what I thought I should be able to do. The holidays approached with a fullness I'd never experienced before. Not just family obligations to fulfill or social expectations to meet, but genuine celebrations to plan and enjoy. David and Jessica were planning their first Christmas as a family of 4, but they insisted I spend the holiday with them in Seattle rather than trying to manage 2 small children's schedules around travel. Grace, now 18 months old, was beginning to show real personality, funny, stubborn, affectionate, intensely curious about everything. James, at 4 months, was settling into his own rhythms and showing signs of being a more easygoing baby than his sister had been. But the gift that meant the most to me that Christmas was the one Grace gave without knowing it. As I sat holding James while Grace played with wrapping paper nearby, she looked up at me and said, clear as day, "Gamma, grandmother." Not the title I'd been hoping someone would remember to use, but the identity I'd earned through presence and consistency and unconditional love, the role I'd finally learned to claim with confidence instead of desperately hope for. "That's right, sweetheart," I said, tears gathering in my eyes. "I'm your Gamma." The new year arrived with resolutions that felt achievable rather than desperate. I wanted to expand my teaching to include advanced classes for students ready to move beyond basics. I wanted to plan my first solo art show, not as part of someone else's event, but as a celebration of my own artistic growth. I wanted to take a real vacation, not just visiting family, but traveling somewhere for the pure joy of seeing new places and having new experiences. Most importantly, I wanted to continue building the life I'd created, rich with friendship and creativity and love that flowed in all directions. A life where I mattered not because of what I could provide others, but because of who I was and how I chose to show up in the world. Anna and I were planning a trip to New Mexico in the spring, a painting retreat in the desert where we could explore new landscapes and challenge ourselves with different kinds of light and color. It would be my first vacation in decades that wasn't built around someone else's schedule or needs. "Are you nervous about traveling somewhere just for fun?" Anna asked as we planned our itinerary. "Excited nervous, not scared nervous," I said. "It feels like something the old Margaret would never have allowed herself to do. The old Margaret didn't know she deserved beautiful experiences just because she's a beautiful person." The painting retreat exceeded our expectations in every way. The New Mexico light was unlike anything I'd ever tried to capture, harsh and soft simultaneously, revealing colors in familiar objects that I'd never noticed before. The desert landscape challenged my East Coast assumptions about beauty, forcing me to expand my artistic vocabulary and emotional range. But more than the technical growth, the trip represented personal freedom I'd never experienced before. 5 days where my time was entirely my own, where I could paint or rest or explore or simply sit in silence without anyone needing anything from me. 5 days where I was simply Margaret, not anyone's mother or grandmother or teacher or friend, just a woman experiencing the world through her own eyes and responding to it through her art. The paintings I created during those 5 days were different from anything I'd done before. Bolder, more experimental, more willing to embrace abstraction and emotion over literal representation. I painted the way sunrise looked on ancient rocks. I painted the sound of coyotes howling at night. I painted the feeling of infinite space and infinite possibility. "These are your best work yet," Anna said as she looked through my desert paintings on our last evening. "They're the most honest," I corrected. I painted what I felt instead of what I thought I should feel. Flying home, I understood something profound about the journey I'd been on. It hadn't been about fixing my relationship with David, or earning Jessica's acceptance, or becoming the grandmother Grace and James needed. Those things had happened, beautifully and meaningfully, but they'd been side effects of something more fundamental. Learning to honor my own experience, to trust my own instincts, to value my own growth and happiness as much as I'd always valued other people's. The woman who'd burned Harold's shirt in desperation 3.5 years earlier had been trying to destroy evidence of her own insignificance. The woman who'd returned from painting in the New Mexico desert understood that significance isn't something other people grant you. It's something you claim for yourself, moment by moment, choice by choice, creative act by creative act. My solo show opened in May at a small gallery in Manhattan, not a prestigious venue, but a real gallery with real walls and real recognition of my work as art worth displaying and purchasing. David and Jessica flew in with both children for the opening. despite the logistical complexity of traveling cross-country with a toddler and an infant. "We wouldn't miss your debut as a real New York artist," David said, as he helped hang Grace's jacket in the gallery closet. "I was already a real artist," I corrected gently. "This is just making it official." The opening was smaller than my Seattle shows, but no less meaningful. People came who knew me from the community center, from the knitting circle, from painting classes I'd taught. They brought friends and family members, creating a network of connection that extended far beyond my immediate circle. But the moment that mattered most came near the end of the evening, when Grace broke away from Jessica's supervision and ran straight to one of my paintings. A portrait I'd done of her sleeping in her crib, surrounded by the flowers I'd painted on her nursery walls. "Gamma!" she shouted, pointing at the painting. "Gamma! Made!" Made. Such a simple word for such a complex act of creation and love and artistic expression. But Grace, with the clarity that children sometimes possess, had identified the essential truth. Her grandmother was someone who made things, who took emptiness and filled it with beauty, who transformed ordinary moments into lasting art. Standing in that gallery, surrounded by people who appreciated my work and my growth, holding James while Grace danced excitedly from painting to painting, recognizing familiar faces and places, I felt a completion that had nothing to do with external validation and everything to do with internal alignment. I had become the person I was meant to be, not by accident or luck, but by choice and effort, and the courage to demand better for myself, even when that felt selfish or unrealistic. The journey from abandonment to belonging, from desperation to dignity, from surviving to thriving, it hadn't been easy or quick or guaranteed. There had been moments when going back to the old patterns would have been easier, when accepting less would have felt safer. But I'd learned something that changed everything. Respect isn't something you ask for or hope for or wait to receive. It's something you model by respecting yourself, something you teach others by showing them how you expect to be treated, something you create by refusing to accept anything less. Now, as I write this story sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where I once waited desperately for phone calls that rarely came, I'm surrounded by evidence of the life I've built. Paintings drying on easels, yarn projects in various stages of completion, photos from my desert retreat, letters from students thanking me for helping them discover their own creativity, a calendar full of commitments and adventures and ordinary Tuesdays that I'm genuinely excited about. My phone rings regularly now, but not because I'm sitting here waiting for it. It rings because I have friends who want to share their days with me, students who need encouragement, children and grandchildren who include me in their lives because they genuinely want my presence, not because they feel obligated to tolerate it. Harold would be proud, I think. Not just of the art I've created or the relationships I've repaired, but of the woman I've become, strong enough to demand respect, wise enough to offer love without losing myself in it, creative enough to build beauty from the raw materials of disappointment and loss and hope. Grace will be too soon. James is crawling now, exploring the world with the same intensity his sister has always shown. David and Jessica are talking about buying a house with enough space for a real art studio, somewhere I can paint when I visit, somewhere Grace and James can make their own creative messes. But even more important than these practical developments is the emotional foundation we've built. A family structure based on mutual respect rather than obligation, on genuine affection rather than dutiful contact, on shared joy rather than managed resentment. It took burning Harold's shirt for me to understand that some things need to be destroyed before they can be recreated. Not the love. That was always real, always valuable, always worth fighting for. But the patterns that had grown up around the love, the expectations and assumptions and unexamined habits that had gradually strangled what should have been nourishing relationships. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people you love is to refuse to enable their worst impulses. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to demand that they rise to meet your respect instead of sinking to accept their neglect. I learned that setting boundaries isn't about building walls. It's about creating spaces where healthy relationships can flourish. It's about teaching people how to treat you by showing them what you will and won't accept. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. At 78, I'm more myself than I've ever been, more creative, more confident, more connected to my own values and desires, more willing to take up space in my own life. The woman who found that shirt was drowning in everyone else's expectations. The woman telling you this story is swimming in possibilities she created for herself. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever wondered when you stopped mattering to the people who should love you most? Have you ever found yourself accepting treatment you knew you didn't deserve because you were afraid that demanding better might leave you with nothing at all? If this story feels familiar, please know this: you deserve better. You deserve respect and kindness and genuine appreciation for who you are, not just what you can provide. You deserve relationships that enhance your life instead of draining it, people who choose your company because they enjoy it, rather than because they're obligated to tolerate it. And most importantly, you deserve to discover parts of yourself that have been buried under years of people-pleasing and self-sacrifice. You deserve to create beauty and find joy and build something meaningful with whatever time you have left. It's never too late to burn the shirts that represent your own diminishment. It's never too late to demand the respect you should have had all along. It's never too late to become the person you were meant to be before life taught you to make yourself smaller. Share your story in the comments below. Let us know if you've lived something similar, or if someone you love needs to hear this message. Like this video if it touched your heart. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about finding strength in unexpected places, and share it with anyone who might need to remember their own worth. Because no one, absolutely no one, should ever feel invisible in their own family, and everyone deserves a life that's full of color and creativity and love that flows in all directions. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for believing that our stories matter, that our growth is possible, that our best days don't have to be behind us. Now go make something beautiful with your life. You deserve nothing less.